Hi ladies, this is the first of two short videos that will walk you through your notes on meiosis, which is the very last portion of chapter 11 and is a process that I don't think you will find to be too challenging because if you can remember mitosis, then you can handle meiosis. So here's a reminder of our essential questions that we have for chapter 11. And these are the same ones that we saw in our Chapter 11 PowerPoint. I've just got them in a little bit different order. But remember that our big question is still, how does cellular info pass from one generation to another? And obviously, Mendel is a big part of that, and we kind of covered these two questions in talking about Mendel. Now our goal is to just look at this one. Right? How does a cell divide to generate cells with half of the original cell's genetic information? Because the answer to this question is the answer that allows us to reproduce. Now, technically, we've been looking at the characteristic of life that all organisms share a universal genetic code, but we've also been looking at the cells a lot and that sort of idea. Today, really for the only time all year, we're going to look at another characteristic of living things, which is that living things reproduce. Now, before you get too nervous, this is not a sexual education PowerPoint or anything like that. We're strictly looking at this from the cellular level. And if you recall from first semester, when we say that a living thing reproduces sexually like humans do, we're not referring to any sort of action at all. What we're referring to from a biological standpoint is the fact that a sexual reproducing organism requires two cells that come together to form a new organism. So, here's a little review of both types of reproduction. Asexual reproduction is where a single organism produces an identical copy of itself. This is primarily just seen in bacteria, and in bacteria or other unicellular organisms we call this binary fission. Binary meaning two, and fission meaning to split, right? So to split into two. Binary fission is a lot like mitosis. It's not quite as complicated and broken into stages like mitosis, but the cell literally just splits into two. And then we have sexual reproduction, as I mentioned just a moment ago on the previous slide. This is where cells from two parents come together to bring about a new organism. Now, that maybe isn't the best definition because if you remember, if we look at a flower, the cells actually come from the same flower. So it doesn't have to be two parents. All we're really talking about is two cells fusing together to form our new organism. There's one problem though, and the one problem with sexual reproduction is that a new organism is only allowed to have the same amount of DNA as the parents. So if you took a whole cell from mom, which if you can remember would have 46 chromosomes, and you took a whole cell from dad, which would have 46 chromosomes, you would be creating a new organism that has 92 chromosomes. And that doesn't work that way. A new baby, if it's the same species of organism, has to have the same number of chromosomes as each parent. So that means the cells that come together in sexual reproduction must only be carrying half of the normal amount of DNA. So the question becomes, how do we make a cell that only has half the DNA of a normal cell? So rather than 46 chromosomes, in the case of a human, 23 chromosomes. Now this is one of my favorite pictures that we have all year. Little sexy geese about to reproduce. You'll notice this thing in the middle of the screen. Usually when we do this in class, I have some background music, turn the lights down, make this as uncomfortable for you as possible. But then we move on and we just look at cellular reproduction issues. Before we get to the true process of meiosis, we need to talk a little bit more about the genetic makeup of an organism and remind you of a couple things from the inheritance material as well. First thing is that every organism, every multicellular organism that results from sexual reproduction contains a certain number of chromosomes. It doesn't have to be 46. I can't remember if we really talked about this or not this year. Different organisms can have different numbers of chromosomes, but in each case, right, the total number of chromosomes is half from your mom and half from your dad. So, in the human case, that means that you are going to get 23 chromosomes from your mother and 23 chromosomes from your father. Now, those should be similar, right? You're going to get one from mom that kind of matches one from dad, and another one from mom that kind of matches another one from dad. So we say that although we have 46 total chromosomes, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, because they do pair together, and we do have corresponding chromosomes from mom and dad. You may or may not know, coming into this class, that we tend to number the chromosomes, right? So you have a chromosome 1, chromosome 2, chromosome 3, and so on. You get a chromosome 1 from your mom and a chromosome 1 from your dad, and a chromosome 2 from your mom and a chromosome 2 from your dad. So you end up with these pairs, and it's a very big vocab word here. We call these homologous pairs of chromosomes. We call them that because they're really similar to each other, and they match together. So again, notice here's this prefix, right? Homo meaning same. So homologous pairs of chromosomes are chromosomes that are almost the same as each other. Now an organism, or sometimes we just talk about a particular cell by itself, that has a double set of DNA, so paired up like ours, like we just saw in the last slide. We call this a diploid organism, or a diploid cell. And diploid is expressed in general over the entire planet as having 2 N chromosomes, where N is any given number. So like I said a minute ago, all organisms don't have 46 like humans. You can have different numbers of chromosomes, but the diploid number is always 2N. So, for instance, for humans, 2N equals 46, because we are diploid organisms. For a fruit fly, like it says here on this slide, fruit flies are also diploid organisms. They only have 8 chromosomes. So for them, 2N equals 8. And the reason we write it this way is because we have a double set. So 2 times some number will give you your diploid number. Now an organism that only has one set of DNA, not pairs, would be called haploid. Now it's not too common to find a haploid organism. Only really in the plant world do we find haploid organisms. But we do find haploid cells. And haploid cells have half the DNA of a diploid cell, right? So a haploid cell we would express as N instead of 2N, and it would be half the diploid number, right? So for the same fruit fly that we saw above, haploid number would be N equal 4, and the diploid or doubled number would be 2N equals 8. For humans, haploid number would be 23, or N equals 23, and so the diploid number would be 2N equals 46. Now, back to our question, how do we get cells with half the number of chromosomes? Or, in other words, how do we get haploid cells inside of a human? Because, spoiler alert, that's what we have, right? We have one type of cell in the human that is haploid, and that is the cell that you can donate or give during sexual reproduction to become part of that new organism. So in most organisms, the way that we form a haploid cell from a diploid cell is meiosis. So your book defines meiosis like it says right here. Meiosis is a process of reduction division, meaning where we're going to reduce the number of chromosomes, in which the number of chromosomes is cut in half, right, through the separation of homologous chromosomes in a diploid cell, resulting in a cell that is haploid. Now this is a lot like mitosis. It just has a few extra steps and a couple different outcomes. Now this is a really important slide. Meiosis actually accomplishes 2 goals for the organism, one of which I've mentioned several times already throughout these first few slides, but the second one I haven't mentioned yet and is probably just as important, if not more important, than the first. So the first one is that we're going to generate those haploid cells. Generate cells with half the amount of DNA so that those cells can be used in sexual reproduction. Our second goal is to generate cells that are genetically different from the original cell and each other. And we call this producing genetic variation. Now, over the next, couple months in class, we're going to touch on genetic variation over and over and over again. It's extraordinarily important that each organism is a little bit different from other organisms. And so we'll kind of come back to this later. This is most important when we look at it from an evolutionary perspective, but it's also just important that we are unique individuals. Now, meiosis involves two distinct division stages, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. Now, each of these, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, is broken into the same 4 steps that we learned in mitosis. There are just a couple of slight tweaks to the details. So we're going to be looking at prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, telophase 1, and then we shift into meiosis 2 and look at prophase 2, metaphase 2, anaphase 2, and telophase 2. Now, the majority of the differences take place in meiosis 1, and meiosis 2 really ends up looking almost just like the mitosis that we learned a while back. So that concludes the first video. Let's switch on to the second one to take a look at this process.